because there's a lot that we need to understand about how this incident in Ferguson needs to be framed and reframed to help us make sense of it. What I want to focus on in my 10 minutes is the rather significant way in which both the media and investigative journalists and general public conversation and political figures have framed this incident in a way that I would argue render it impossible to understand. That the public framing of what happened has been turned into a very microscopic context. That is to say, what did this one policeman do? What was his intent? What was his purpose? What was his condition? What does this young man, Michael Brown, mean? What was he up to? What kind of person was he? What kind of family does he come from? All of those kinds of, on both sides of that seemingly impossible divide. This micro focus absolutely undermines our ability to understand why Ferguson and what happened there was more than just a one-off example of an individual in conflict with a law enforcement representative. At any moment, there are going to be conflicts that young people might have with any number of police officers around the world. It's, as you know, Stefano pointed out, there are structural ways in which that happens. But that does not automatically mean that there's one individual who's done something wrong and the other one has done something right. There's conflict, it happens. What makes thousands of people stand up, not one night, not 2 nights, not 3 nights, but 2 solid weeks in the face of elevated submachine guns, which those who've been trained say you never, even in the theater of war, carry it in the face of individuals. What constitutes the context for the level of outrage, the crying, the sobbing, the elderly, the young people, the children, the 30-year-olds, the 40-year-olds, not just the teenagers, but everyone? What provoked that kind of outrage? What made Ferguson, in this moment and the shooting of this young man, a tipping point? That is the central journalistic mainstream media question that has gone completely unaddressed, and that allows us not necessarily the matter of side taking, but it allows us to understand the context. And that context takes it out of the individual circumstances of this one moment on this one day and helps us make not only enormous sense of everyone's investment in challenging not just the police but the entire structure of authority and policy in the town, but why thousands of people would come from around not just to be vultures but come to stand in support because they themselves find these kinds of conditions everywhere else. So this reframing requires that we understand what is going on in what has been called the post-civil rights era. As my colleague, Professor Bogues, called it, quote-unquote, post-race. But I want to bring us back just a little bit before that fabulous, charming iteration came into existence. And I want to talk a bit about the struggle and the crisis of the last 40 years, what people like to call the era after legalized racial segregation and subordination and a lack of legal status was overturned. The point at which we legally make the claim as a nation that it is unlawful and illegal to structurally discriminate against black people is the moment in which we now transform our practices from explicit racialized laws to laws that produce obvious racial results, but that have no racial name in the beginning. So what you have is a race-neutral seeming policy that produces deeply racialized outcomes. Sociologists of a variety of types would call this structural racism. It doesn't have the language of, say, 1940s racism or bigotry or personal attitudes. You can, in fact, have a lot of friends of color and benefit dramatically from structural racism, right? I mean, sorry. That's how it goes. Didn't know I was going to be able to find a joke in this one today. This wasn't feeling funny when I was thinking about it. So what happens under structural racism is that we have a new set of circumstances that happen seemingly invisibly. right? So we can't explain the rage of the community there because it looks crazy, right? It looks, what are they so worked up about? We have laws that protect people. This is one bad guy. If we can just get him in jail or get him off the force or put him on admin leave or do some kind of crazy thing for this one, we'll be cool. Because all the laws are set up and we don't know very many people who harbor explicit racialized hatred attitudes, right? This is the world in which we have created, as Bonilla Silva might call it, the sociologist from Duke, racism without racists, right? So we have no more racists, but we have enormous amounts of structural racism. So now how does this happen? It happens in every element of life. I don't have anywhere near the amount of time it would take to unpack this, but if we took every significant component of human existence, where we live and how we live and whether or not there are discriminatory practices in determining that, the wealth we accrue versus our income, two very different indicators, vast structural differences. Just recently, the average wealth-based assets for white Americans, $134,000 a year. For Latinos and blacks, under $10,000. Okay, so you're looking at a wealth gap that's staggering. Income gaps are dramatic. Educational gaps determined largely by housing property values, which are also discriminatorily applied, significant and relentless in intergenerational effect. Job discrimination, incredible study called Race at Work by a couple of Princeton sociologists, dictate the most staggering levels of job-based discrimination that's fascinating. One of the most amazing results, I'll just give you 1 minute of it, is that a white male job applicant with a criminal record, a felony record, has a better chance of a second callback than a black young person with a college degree and no felony record. I couldn't make this research up. It would, you know, just glad someone else did it. But that's staggeringly important. That means, imagine you're a black person with a felony record, which in this era of mass incarceration, your odds are extremely high. Now you're looking at job discrimination as a lifetime condition. And I'm not mentioning police brutality, I'm not mentioning police profiling or stop and frisk, I'm not talking about longer sentences for smaller crimes or for drugs that people of color use, getting 10 times the sentences that drugs that white people use, even though they're all produce similar highs. No, this is not, I often tell my students in my lecture classes that if I were to bring search dogs and drug-sniffing search dogs to my predominantly white classes at whatever school I've been teaching at, whatever year it is, half of the class would go to jail. And they look at me very frightened because they think, maybe she's going to bring some dogs in here. And what will we do? And so part of it is the policing of an entire community that generates these outcomes, which is enabled by physical structural racism through housing segregation, which is forced both by white flight and poverty and by redlining and by subprime lending. And you create a web of institutional structural forces that create suffocation, rage, despair, and impossibility in an era in which race, in fact, doesn't seem to exist. That is the context for Ferguson. Now, the second context for Ferguson that's crucial is the illiteracy about this gap. The illiteracy about this gap is not a casual oversight. It is intentionally produced. And it's produced so that we can't focus on it because it is and will be a very substantial change if we were to do so. And so the illiteracy that we continually generate by focusing in on, did Michael Brown steal a cigar? Was this cop a racist before? You know, whatever the, shenanigans are about refusing to look at the big picture over and over and over again, and not adding up the number of young people who've been shot down and killed or beaten to death for a variety of reasons that are unjustified in the end. To not string those together and ask the big picture retains a level of illiteracy and really foments the kind of rage that young people have. And I want to say in closing very quickly that this is not something that's outside of Brown. People come to Brown from everywhere, and many of us come from communities that face these kinds of conditions. And so you needn't imagine that this is just an intellectual exchange, although it is. But it is also about knowing that our illiteracy has consequences, short-term consequences, mid-range, and long-term. And so if there's anything I want you to take away from my comments and from this teach-in, is that not knowing is not a luxury we can afford any longer. Thank you very much.